Before the dazzling lights of live television cameras and dozens of international leaders gathered, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance cast a scornful glance toward the young leader of the West African nation, Burkina Faso. A smug smile spread across his face as Vance raised his voice with an arrogance impossible to conceal, leaving the entire room stunned into silence. "Who are you to speak of democracy? A military man who seized power by force, and now he presumes to lecture on sovereignty or international relations." The room fell into a breathless hush. Senior diplomats exchanged uneasy glances, while journalists frantically scribbled notes, realizing this could be a pivotal moment, broadcast live to millions. Ibrahim Traoré, only 34 years old, took a deep breath. He had to stand firm against the public humiliation from the vice president of one of the world's leading superpowers, right on American soil. What happened next not only caught Vance completely off guard, but also created one of the most embarrassing moments in recent international diplomatic history. Traoré's response not only dismantled the arrogant speech of the U.S. Vice President, but also exposed decades of hypocrisy that many African leaders have long recognized, but rarely had the courage to publicly denounce on live global television. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. This tense scene unfolded at the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, held at a convention center in Washington, D.C. It was a significant event, bringing together heads of state and high-level delegations to discuss strategic partnerships, security, and development aid between the United States and African nations. It was meant to be a ceremonial and constructive event, but it quickly turned into a direct confrontation. Vice President Vance, clearly irritated by Burkina Faso's recent decisions to reduce U.S. and Western influence in the country, chose to use his speaking time in the main discussion session to publicly attack the young African leader. Vance's strategy seemed clear. Discredit Traoré in front of other world leaders and prove that the United States still maintained influence and leadership over nations it had supported and partnered with for decades. Ibrahim Traoré is not a traditional politician. A professional military officer, he led a coup to assume leadership of Burkina Faso after overthrowing the previous military regime. His rise to power sparked international controversy, but quickly gained widespread domestic support. Traoré vowed to fiercely combat the expansion of extremist groups, which had seized nearly 60% of the country's territory, while breaking what he called neo-colonial influence that had hindered the nation's true development. The United States, though not a direct former colonial power in Burkina Faso, maintained strong economic interests in the region, particularly in mineral extraction. Burkina Faso is rich in gold, one of Africa's largest producers, alongside significant reserves of manganese, zinc, lead, and silver. Many Western corporations, including those with U.S. ties, control much of this extraction through agreements that many Burkinabe view as unequal and detrimental to the local economy. Upon taking power, Traoré began reviewing these agreements and seeking new international partners, including powers like Russia and China. This deeply unsettled the U.S. administration. The decision to reduce the Western military presence in the country and demand the withdrawal of foreign soldiers operating under the guise of counterterrorism was the final straw for Vice President Vance. A conservative, America First politician, previously criticized for his hardline foreign policy, Vance saw the summit as an opportunity to reassert U.S. strength. His verbal attack on Traoré was calculated to undermine the legitimacy of Burkina Faso's government. Vice President Vance's verbal assault on Traoré was carefully calculated to strike at the legitimacy of Burkina Faso's government. With a patronizing and condescending tone, Vance questioned the young military leader's ability to govern a challenging nation, implying that without US support, the African country would descend into chaos. The cameras zoomed in on Ibrahim Traoré's face, searching for signs of fear or anxiety. The silence following Vance's words was widely interpreted as a sign that the young leader had been cornered by the diplomatic experience and power of the US vice president. Ibrahim Traoré, you need to understand that running a country is not like commanding a battalion. International relations require diplomatic finesse, not force. The United States has always been a friend to Burkina Faso and will continue to be, regardless of your rash decisions, Vance declared with a tone of feigned concern, barely concealing the implied threat. Broadcast live worldwide. Those present at the summit, particularly Western delegations, expected a ceremonial response, perhaps even a diplomatic concession from the Burkina Faso leader under pressure. After all, openly confronting the vice president of a superpower like the United States could bring severe economic and diplomatic consequences for his already struggling nation. Vance's advisors seemed pleased with the effect his speech had created. Some US diplomats even prepared for the next part of the event, as if the matter had been settled. At that moment, Ibrahim Traoré requested the right to respond. Vance's expression visibly shifted when the summit moderator handed the microphone to the president of Burkina Faso. Discomfort and surprise were evident on his face, as if he hadn't anticipated a direct confrontation. Traoré calmly adjusted the microphone, took a sip of water, and looked directly at Vance before beginning to speak. What no one expected was that this moment would become one of the most powerful speeches on African sovereignty and neo-colonialism in recent years. Traoré's response not only defended his country's sovereignty, but also exposed the contradictions in US foreign policy and the hypocrisy of a partnership narrative that masked exploitative economic interests. Each word from the African leader struck Vance like a blow, dismantling the carefully crafted narrative of US diplomacy over decades. The US vice president's face gradually changed as Traoré spoke, showing increasing discomfort captured mercilessly by the cameras. The international press, initially paying little attention to the clash between a global superpower's leader and a representative of a small African nation, quickly realized they were witnessing a historic moment. Reporters began scribbling furiously, with Chayton West, a veteran journalist from a global news outlet, typing rapidly on his tablet. The cameras shifted angles constantly, capturing every expression on Vance's face as Traoré's sharp words landed. The impact of the response was so significant that some leaders present, particularly from African nations and developing countries, openly showed support for Traoré with nods and gestures of approval. For many of them, the young leader was voicing decades of pent-up frustrations, rarely expressed so directly in international forums. Ibrahim Traoré does not have the typical appearance of a head of state or seasoned politician. With a slender build and calm demeanor at 34, he was one of the youngest leaders at the Washington, D.C. summit. The military uniform he wore, in stark contrast to the polished suits of other officials, symbolized the turbulent origins and context of his rise to power in Burkina Faso. Hailing from a humble rural family, Traoré joined the armed forces early and built his military career amid growing terrorist threats destabilizing the Sahel region. His ascent to power came not through traditional politics but via a military coup which he and his supporters deemed necessary to save the country from collapse. Arriving at the summit, the young leader had few expectations. He knew he would face skepticism from Western leaders, particularly the US delegation. Burkina Faso, a former colony of a European power, still maintained close economic ties with the Westies, many Burkinabe viewed as unfair and obstructive to true national development. Since taking power, Traoré had made significant changes to the country's foreign policy, striving to diversify partnerships and reduce historical dependence on former colonial powers. The tension between Vice President Vance and Traore didn't emerge suddenly at the summit. In the weeks prior, Burkina Faso's government had made decisions that deeply frustrated Washington. Reviewing mining contracts with Western corporations, demanding the withdrawal of foreign troops stationed under the pretext of counterterrorism, and especially strengthening ties with Russia and China for new investments and military support, all these moves irritated U.S. officials. For Vance, these actions represented a direct challenge to U.S. interests in the region and a dangerous questioning of the influence America sought to maintain over African nations. Vice President Vance arrived at the summit determined to reassert his authority. Facing growing domestic criticism over inconsistent foreign policy and pressure from industries worried about losing access to Africa's valuable resources, the U.S. Vice President planned to use the event to send a clear message. The United States remained a global superpower with unchallenged influence, especially over governments he deemed illegitimate, like Traore's. The confrontation began during a discussion on the future of U.S.-Africa partnership. Challenges and opportunities in a multipolar world, a seemingly neutral topic that quickly became the stage for a clash between two starkly different visions of relations between superpowers and developing nations. Vance spoke first, presenting the U.S. perspective on international cooperation with a polished speech about partnership, humanitarian aid, and shared development. His diplomatic, Western-style rhetoric carried subtle criticisms of nations seeking to disrupt what he called proven historic partnerships, to pursue opportunistic alliances with powers that do not share our democratic values. When it was his turn to speak, Traore presented a completely different vision, focusing on the right of African nations to determine their own destinies and choose their international partners without external interference. It was at this moment that Vance, clearly irritated by what he saw as a blatant challenge to U.S. dominance, interrupted Traore's presentation. His anger was evident in his voice, signaling a fiery confrontation. Vance stared intently at Traore, his gaze cold as if trying to pierce through him. "Mr. Traore," Vance interjected abruptly, his voice echoing through the room. "I notice you're passionately talking about self-determination and choosing partners. But does self-determination include collaborating with forces seeking to undermine the global order that we and our democratic partners have worked so hard to build?" The atmosphere in the room grew thick. This was no longer an academic discussion, but an open diplomatic battle. Traore remained unshaken. He maintained a remarkably calm demeanor, facing the U.S. Vice President's aggression head-on. "Vice President Vance," Traore responded, his voice steady yet resolute, "we are not seeking to undermine the global order. We are simply seeking a fairer order, where Africa's voice is heard and respected, where cooperation is not a veneer for dependency." Each of Traore's words was a precise counter, not only to Vance's arguments but to a history of injustice. He turned Vance's arrogant rhetoric into an opportunity to highlight the hypocrisy of superpowers and Africa's burning desire for autonomy. Traore didn't stop there. He continued to expose the hypocrisy of Western diplomatic policy. "You speak of counterterrorism," Traore said, his steady gaze locked on Vance. "But what have you done as these extremist groups thrived right before our eyes? You sent troops, but have you ever truly helped us address the root causes of terrorism, like extreme poverty, social inequality, and the lack of opportunities that your own economic policies have helped create?" He paused briefly, as if to let his words sink into everyone in the room. "You talk about development aid, but is it truly aid, or merely an investment to maintain your control? Do you care about our people having education, clean water, or healthcare, or are you simply ensuring our resources keep flowing steadily to your markets?" Traore's words were not just a rebuttal. They were a historical indictment, a direct challenge to the power structures that had persisted for decades. He turned Vance's arrogant rhetoric into an opportunity to highlight the hypocrisy of superpowers and Africa's burning desire for autonomy. Vance, clearly unprepared for such a confrontation, tried to maintain composure, but his body began to betray clear signs of discomfort. He gripped the podium tightly, his jaw clenched, and his face gradually reddened. He seemed to be struggling to contain a hidden rage. Traore continued, his voice resonating through the room, now not only resolute, but imbued with the pride of a nation. "When we seek new partners, Vice President," he said, "it is not betrayal. It is exercising our right to self-determination. It is diversifying our relationships to ensure the best interests of our people, not the interests of any one superpower. Our independence does not mean new dependence on anyone, but the right to decide our own future." Traore's speech touched on a sensitive issue, not only for Burkina Faso but for many African and developing nations. He clearly articulated the desire for genuine partnerships based on respect, fairness, and mutual benefit, rather than dependency and imposition. As Traore concluded his speech, the room seemed to hold its breath. Diplomats and delegates from many African and developing nations began exchanging glances, then slowly, discreet nods and approving smiles appeared. For many, the young leader from Burkina Faso was not only voicing decades of pent-up frustrations, but also paving a new path for the continent's voice. Vance remained frozen in place, his eyes fixed on Traore, with clear anger and embarrassment on his face. He hadn't expected a meticulously prepared attack speech to be so publicly and directly dismantled by a leader he had sought to diminish. This moment went down in international diplomatic history as a powerful reminder of the shifting dynamics of global power and the relentless aspiration for true sovereignty among developing nations. Traore met Vance's furious gaze without flinching. "Regarding our decision to seek new international partners," Traore continued, his voice maintaining remarkable calm, but now with a sharper edge, "this is not an ideological experiment, as you implied. It is the fundamental exercise of our national sovereignty. The United States cannot claim to be the global guardian of democracy while treating African nations as pieces of its geopolitical backyard." Traore's speech exposed the contradictions that Western diplomacy, particularly that of the United States, has long tried to conceal. His methodical and sharp response surprised many. They had expected a young military officer to be intimidated by the political experience and authority of the U.S. Vice President. Instead, Traore demonstrated a profound understanding of the complex dynamics of U.S.-Africa relations and an extraordinary ability to articulate the shared frustrations of many nations across the continent. The tension in the conference room was palpable. As Ibrahim Traoré continued his rebuttal, those present witnessed something rare in international diplomacy, the collapse of the polite facade that typically conceals such high-level encounters. The young leader from Burkina Faso had touched on open wounds in the relationship between the United States and African nations, bringing to light issues usually discussed only behind closed doors. "Vice President Vance," Traoré said, "you claim that Burkina Faso needs the United States. Allow me to reverse that perspective. It is the United States that has relied on Africa's resources for centuries," his voice steady, resonating through the silent room. "Our gold, our uranium, our strategic minerals are still extracted under agreements that disproportionately benefit foreign companies, many of them American. When we question these agreements, we are immediately labeled anti-democratic or accused of conducting ideological experiments." Vance's face, previously confident and slightly mocking, now showed clear discomfort. The U.S. Vice President was unaccustomed to being confronted in this manner, especially by a leader who, in the traditional view of Western diplomacy, should have shown deference to a major superpower. Vance's advisers appeared anxious, exchanging glances and whispering urgently. One of them tried to pass Vance a note, but he brushed it aside with an irritated gesture. "The United States speaks of counter-terrorism in the Sahel," Traore continued, touching on a particularly sensitive point. "But we must ask why terrorism has grown exponentially in this region precisely during the period of the strongest U.S. military presence. Our people are starting to question the effectiveness of this presence. After years of military operations with thousands of American soldiers on our soil, terrorist groups have not only survived but multiplied. There is legitimate reason to question whether the real goal is counter-terrorism or securing privileged access to our resources." A loud murmur rippled through the room. Some diplomats from other African nations nodded subtly in agreement, a clear sign of concurrence. For many of them, Traore was voicing long-held suspicions about the true nature of Western military presence in the Sahel. When we decide to review these agreements and seek new partners, we are not rejecting the United States as a nation or its people, for whom we still hold great respect, Traore continued, adjusting his tone to show that his words stemmed not from personal hostility, but from a higher principle. We are simply asserting our autonomy and pursuing the best interests of our people. This autonomy, Vice President, Traore said, his voice sharpening as if cutting into his opponent's weakness, is not empty theory. It is a nation's right to determine its own destiny without needing permission from anyone. When we propose African solutions to African problems, it is not isolationism but confidence. We have the resources, we have the intellect, and we have the will to build our future. What we need is respect, not imposition. Vance was visibly cornered, his face flushed, his gaze shifting from anger to an unfamiliar look of discomposure. He ignored the whispers of his advisors, trying to hand him a tablet with talking points. The usual arrogance of Vance had completely vanished, replaced by the expression of someone realizing they had misjudged their opponent. "You speak of stability," Traore continued, giving Vance no moment to regain composure. "But what is that stability built upon? Is it stability when millions of our people still live without clean water, healthcare, or education, while our country's resources are drained? True stability comes only when justice is established, when the people's voices are heard, and when national interests are prioritized." He leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked on Vance as a final challenge. "Our seeking new partners from Russia, China, or any other nation is our right. It is part of a strategy to diversify and reduce unilateral dependence, to build a more sustainable economy. We will work with anyone who respects our sovereignty and commits to delivering real benefits to the people of Burkina Faso, not those who merely wish to continue exploitation under the guise of aid or partnership." The entire room held its breath. Traore's speech was not just a powerful rebuttal, it was a bold declaration of the awakening of a new generation of African leaders. They no longer accepted a passive role, condescending rhetoric, or exploitation in any form. As Traore concluded, a wave of applause erupted across the room. It was not polite clapping, but an outpouring of agreement, admiration, and relief. African delegates stood, clapping enthusiastically, some even raising fists in support. Diplomats from other developing nations quickly joined, creating a rare scene, open solidarity against a superpower. Vance stood still, his eyes seemingly vacant, staring into the space before him. He had completely lost control of the situation. Traore's speech not only publicly humiliated him, but also dismantled the image of power Vance had tried to project. He hadn't anticipated that a young leader from a small nation could stand firm and deliver such a devastating blow in the heart of Washington, D.C., before the eyes of the world. Reporters like Chayton West typed furiously, capturing every detail. This event would dominate global headlines, marking a turning point in international relations and amplifying the voice of developing nations. For Burkina Faso and many other African countries, Traoré was not just a leader but a new symbol of freedom, dignity, and self-determination. Our criticism, Traoré said, his voice growing firmer yet still controlled, is aimed at policies, not the United States as a nation. We are simply exercising our sovereign right to determine our development path. If this is seen as an offense in Washington, then perhaps it's time for you to reflect on the true nature of this relationship. Finally, Vance could no longer contain his frustration. Breaking all diplomatic protocol, he demanded the moderator grant him an immediate response. The moderator, clearly uncomfortable with the discussion's turn, reluctantly agreed. "I appreciate President Traoré's perspective," Vance began, emphasizing Traoré's lower military rank with a slightly dismissive tone. "But I must correct some distortions. The United States has invested billions of dollars in development aid to Burkina Faso and the entire Sahel region. Our military has risked their lives fighting terrorist groups threatening regional stability," Vance said, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "To suggest we have interests beyond the region's security and prosperity is not only unfair but also a simplistic view of contemporary international relations." The U.S. Vice President tried to reclaim the narrative, invoking traditional rhetoric about aid and cooperation that has shaped Western discourse on Africa for decades. However, his body language stiff posture, occasional pointing at Traoré, raised voice betrayed his growing frustration. "Regarding the economic agreements you mentioned," Vance continued, "they were all negotiated with sovereign governments and adhere to international standards. The United States imposes nothing on anyone. If there are imbalances, we are always ready to negotiate adjustments, provided they occur through proper diplomatic channels, not unilateral decisions that undermine trust between partners." Traoré listened intently, his face impassive, revealing no emotion. When Vance finished, the moderator hesitated briefly before reluctantly handing the microphone back to the Burkina Faso leader. "Vice President Vance," Traoré said, his voice still calm but carrying tremendous weight, "you mentioned billions of dollars in development aid. Allow me to ask directly, for every dollar of aid invested, how many dollars return to the United States through the extraction of our natural resources?" Traoré's question was posed calmly, but its impact was devastating. "These figures are public. U.S. companies extract resources worth tens of billions of dollars annually, while development aid is a mere fraction of that. This is not charity when you profit far more than you invest." The room fell silent. Journalists typed frantically on their laptops, aware they were witnessing a historic moment. "As for the sovereignty of past agreements, we must be honest about the context in which they were negotiated," Traoré continued. "Many were established shortly after we gained formal independence, when our nations were still heavily dependent on Western powers. Others were signed by leaders propped up by Western support even against their people's will. Calling these agreements sovereign is questionable, to say the least." Traoré then stood, a gesture that surprised everyone. His posture was commanding. It was the stance of someone speaking not only for himself, but for generations of Africans who had seen their countries formally independent, yet economically controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, what Burkina Faso is doing today is not rejecting cooperation," Traoré affirmed, his voice ringing clear. "It is demanding fairness." "It is not international cooperation," Traoré declared, raising his voice slightly to emphasize his words, "but a demand that cooperation be based on mutual respect, equitable benefits, and true sovereignty." He continued, "When we review mineral contracts, it is not an ideological whim but a desire to ensure our natural resources first benefit our own people. When we diversify our international partnerships, it is not to provoke anyone, but because we believe fair competition among partners will bring us better opportunities." At that moment, something unexpected happened. The representative from Mali, a neighboring country facing similar challenges as Burkina Faso, began clapping. Quickly, other African diplomats joined in, creating a wave of support that spread across the room. The moderator, visibly uncomfortable, tried to restore order by tapping the microphone, but the applause continued for nearly a minute. Vance watched the scene with an indescribable expression, a mix of surprise, frustration, and perhaps a hint of reflection. His advisers gathered around, whispering urgently, likely advising him on how to respond to this unexpected situation. When silence finally returned, Traore concluded his response with words that would resonate long after the meeting. True cooperation, Vice President Vance, is not based on historical dependency or economic control disguised as partnership. It is based on recognizing that both sides have dignity, both have legitimate interests, and both deserve equal benefits from the relationship. That is the kind of cooperation Burkina Faso seeks with the United States if there is genuine interest, or with other partners willing to treat us as equals. The silence that followed was profound. The moderator, clearly relieved to shift the discussion, quickly announced that the session had ended and delegates should move to the adjacent hall for the official lunch. The confrontation between Vance and Traore did not end with the formal session. As delegates moved to the hall where the official lunch was served, the atmosphere remained tense. Journalists present, recognizing the historic value of this diplomatic clash, immediately surrounded the Burkina Faso leader, peppering him with questions about his bold response to the U.S. Vice President. President Traore, aren't you afraid of economic or diplomatic retaliation after directly confronting Vice President Vance? A Reuters journalist asked. Traore gave a slight smile before responding, maintaining the calm and resolve he had shown throughout the debate. What should we fear more, possible retaliation for speaking the truth today, or the certainty of remaining trapped in unequal relationships for generations to come? My people have decided they would rather face the uncertainties of true independence than the certainty of neo-colonialism. His response was met with approving nods from many African diplomats still standing nearby, forming a circle of solidarity around the young leader. At that moment, Traore had become a spokesperson for a shared sentiment among many African nations, a genuine desire for economic and political liberation from former powers. Across the hall, Vance was quickly exiting, surrounded by his security team and advisors. His face still showed anger, now mixed with a clear sense of defeat. He did not stop to answer any questions from the press, passing them with a cold expression. This confrontation was not just a personal moment, it was a sign of a broader shift in relations between powerful and less powerful nations on the global stage. Meanwhile, in another corner of the hall, J.D. Vance was quickly exiting, surrounded by his security team and advisors. His face still showed anger, now mixed with a clear sense of defeat. He didn't stop to answer any questions from the press, merely passing them with a cold expression. This confrontation was not just a personal moment, it was a sign of a broader shift in the relationship between powerful and less powerful nations on the global stage. During the lunch, the event organizers had deliberately seated Vance and Traore at tables far apart. However, this did not prevent the confrontation from becoming the focal point of every conversation. Diplomats and world leaders whispered about what had happened, many expressing amazement at the eloquence and courage of the young African leader in confronting one of the most powerful figures in American politics. "I've never seen anything like this in my 30 years of diplomatic service," a Scandinavian ambassador whispered to a colleague. Usually, such confrontations, if they happen at all, take place behind closed doors. To witness an African leader directly challenge Western rhetoric so openly and with such historical precision is truly unprecedented. Meanwhile, on social media, clips from the debate began spreading rapidly. Journalists and political observers shared videos of the confrontation, and they quickly went viral. Hashtags like #Traore's VANCE and #Africa's Rise Up dominated global trends. Traore's response resonated not only in Africa, but also in regions worldwide that had faced Western colonialism. The impact of the confrontation was amplified by an unexpected fact. Throughout the debate, a conference technician had kept the cameras rolling, even as the moderator tried to shift attention to the next event. This allowed the world to witness not only the verbal clash, but also the authentic reactions of both leaders, Vance's growing frustration and Traore's steadfast calm. By mid-afternoon, the White House spokesperson from the U.S. President's office issued an official statement to downplay the incident. Vice President Vance reaffirms the United States' commitment to Africa's development and regrets that differences of opinion on complex issues were interpreted as a personal confrontation. The United States remains committed to constructive dialogue with all African nations, including Burkina Faso. The statement, clearly an attempt at damage control, starkly contrasted with the reality witnessed by hundreds at the event. For many observers, it only reinforced the impression that U.S. diplomacy had taken a significant blow and was on the defensive. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, news of the confrontation spread quickly. Spontaneous crowds gathered in the city's main squares, watching videos of the debate on mobile phones and makeshift screens. What had initially seemed like a routine diplomatic meeting had turned into a moment of national pride. Ordinary citizens, students, workers and traders passionately discussed how their young leader had confronted the vice president of a global superpower and voiced truths long silenced in official diplomatic circles. He said what we've all been thinking for decades, Amara Ouedraogo, a university professor, told a local television station. This isn't about rejecting cooperation with France or any other nation. It's about demanding respect and equitable relationships. Traore expressed that in a way no recent leader has. On the capital's streets, young people painted murals depicting the confrontation, with Traore's quotes reproduced on banners and posters. True cooperation is not based on historical dependency, quickly became a rallying slogan at supportive rallies. National pride was palpable, transcending internal political divides. Even critics of the military government viewed the confrontation with Macron as a moment of asserting national dignity. Back in Washington, D.C., on the second day of the summit, the dynamics had shifted significantly. Western diplomats who had previously paid little attention to Traore's presence now observed the young leader with a mix of respect and caution. The confrontation with Vance had instantly elevated his international stature, transforming him from a lesser-known military leader into a significant voice in the debate on post-colonial relations. The U.S. delegation opted for avoidance. Vance cancelled his participation in the remaining sessions, citing urgent commitments in Washington, D.C., an excuse few believed. His advisors worked behind the scenes, trying to ensure the incident did not spark similar confrontations with other African leaders present. However, it was too late. In a session on regional security and international cooperation, Mali's president directly referenced Traore's speech, reinforcing questions about the effectiveness of Western military presence in the Sahel. Niger's representative, in turn, announced their country's intent to review all mining agreements with foreign companies to ensure natural resources primarily benefited Niger's people. What began as an isolated confrontation between two leaders was quickly turning into a broader movement, questioning the economic and political relationships between the West and Africa. International journalists started using terms like Traore moment and African Spring to describe what seemed like a turning point in post-colonial relations. In European capitals, political and economic analysts monitored the developments with growing concern. A reputable French think tank issued an urgent report warning that France's traditional model of influence in West Africa faced its most serious challenge in decades, recommending an immediate reassessment of economic and security policies in the region. For Ibrahim Traoré, the personal and political impact of the confrontation was immediate. Within less than 24 hours, his international profile had transformed. Leaders from African, Asian, and Latin American nations who had previously avoided him now sought private meetings, eager to hear more about his vision for a new international relations order based on greater fairness. What happened yesterday wasn't about me or Vance, Traore explained at an impromptu press conference on the summit's third day. It was about a necessary shift in how nations with colonial histories interact in the 21st century. Africa isn't rejecting cooperation with Europe or any other region. We're only rejecting the continuation of unequal relationships disguised as cooperation, Traore continued, his voice resounding. It's a rejection of a model that has hindered our development for decades. A response from Washington, D.C. came by the end of the week, with the U.S. State Department announcing a strategic review of its West Africa policy. The official statement spoke of adapting to the region's new geopolitical realities, an implicit acknowledgement that the previous status quo was no longer sustainable. Analysts noted that the statement contained no direct criticism of Traoré or Burkina Faso's government, signaling a possible de-escalation effort. 2 weeks after the confrontation, a delegation of U.S. mining industry executives arrived in Ouagadougou for preliminary discussions on revising existing contracts. This was a significant concession, as the official stance had previously been that these contracts were untouchable. The delegation included no U.S. government representatives, a detail not missed by observers, who interpreted it as Vance's attempt to distance himself personally from the negotiations while still allowing practical progress. In an interview with an international news agency a month after the incident, Traoré reflected on its significance. What happened in Washington was merely a catalyst for a conversation already happening across the African continent, he said. For decades, we've discussed internally the need to transform our relationships with former powers. What's changed is that this conversation has now moved beyond narrow academic and political circles into the global public sphere. The confrontation's impact extended beyond US-Africa relations. Other Western nations with significant African presence began reassessing their approaches, fearing similar challenges. A week after the Washington summit, Germany's foreign ministry announced a new initiative for equal partnerships with African nations, emphasizing mutual respect and shared benefits. For Ibrahim Traoré, the challenge now was turning that international moment into tangible benefits for his country. Burkina Faso still faced serious security threats from extremist groups, controlling significant portions of its territory. The economy remained fragile, reliant on commodity exports and vulnerable to external shocks. The transitional government he led still needed to prove its ability to improve citizens' living conditions effectively. Words matter, but they're only the beginning, Traore declared in his first nationwide address after returning from Washington. The real challenge to our sovereignty lies not in diplomatic confrontations, but in our ability to build a safer, more prosperous, and fairer Burkina Faso. Our people cannot eat speeches or survive on international applause. We need to turn this moment into concrete changes that benefit every citizen. 6 months after the confrontation with Vance, the first tangible results began to emerge. 3 of the largest mining companies operating in Burkina Faso agreed to renegotiate contracts, significantly increasing royalties paid to the government and including commitments to local mineral processing, creating more jobs and added value domestically. The Russian government, in turn, provided military equipment and training to the national armed forces, enabling more effective campaigns against terrorist groups and reclaiming control of key strategic areas. Initial successes in retaking territories previously controlled by extremists demonstrated the effectiveness of this strategy. The Traore doctrine, as some international analysts began calling his foreign policy approach, inspired similar movements in other African nations. Mali, Niger, the Central African Republic and Guinea began reviewing economic agreements with former colonial powers, seeking better terms and diversifying their international partnerships. The confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and J.D. Vance in Washington, D.C. marked a turning point in relations between former Western colonial powers and African nations. What began as an isolated diplomatic clash quickly became a symbol of something much larger: the growing aspiration of African nations to redefine their place on the global stage, no longer as passive recipients of aid or cooperation, but as equal partners seeking genuinely mutually beneficial relationships. A year after the historic confrontation, international analysts spoke of a before and after Washington, D.C. when referring to U.S.-Africa relations. The impact was felt not only in Burkina Faso, but across the African continent, where political leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens found in Traoré's words an expression of long-suppressed sentiments and frustrations in formal diplomatic forums. What Traoré did was break a taboo. Dr. Aminata Diallo, a professor of international relations at the University of Dakar, explained. For decades, there was an unspoken understanding that certain truths about post-colonial relations shouldn't be voiced publicly, especially by sitting African leaders. This diplomatic silence allowed imbalanced economic practices to persist under the guise of historic partnerships. One of the clearest consequences was a significant increase in public scrutiny of economic agreements between Western and African nations. Civil society organizations across African countries began demanding greater transparency in mining contracts, trade agreements, and development aid programs. Investigative journalists started publishing detailed analyses of financial flows between the West and Africa, exposing inequalities rarely discussed outside specialized academic circles. For the United States, the challenge of adapting to this new reality was particularly pronounced. After decades of maintaining what many critics called a backyard in Africa, the country saw its traditional influence seriously challenged. U.S. companies, long operating under highly favorable conditions in former colonial nations, now faced increasing competition from Chinese, Russian, Turkish, and other firms willing to offer better terms. Vance himself, initially reluctant to acknowledge the confrontation's significance, was eventually forced to adjust his rhetoric and policies. In a notable speech at a foreign policy forum 6 months after the incident, the U.S. Vice President spoke for the first time about the need to completely reshape U.S.-Africa relations, acknowledging that the 20th century model was no longer suited to the challenges and aspirations of the 21st century. Though he avoided directly mentioning Traoré or Burkina Faso, the connection to the Washington, D.C. events was clear to all observers. For Ibrahim Traoré, the challenge was even greater, translating the political and diplomatic capital gained from the confrontation into concrete improvements for his country. Burkina Faso still faced immense challenges in security, economic development, and political stability. The transitional government, led by Traoré, implemented a series of economic reforms, including renegotiating mining contracts, which significantly increased state revenue, enabling greater investment in infrastructure, education, and healthcare. However, the security issue remains serious. Extremist groups still controlled some areas of the country's territory, despite progress made with military support from new partners like Russia and Turkey. Critics at home and abroad questioned whether diversifying international partnerships would suffice to address the country's deep structural challenges. The real challenge to our sovereignty lies not in the words we speak at international conferences, but in our ability to build a nation where every citizen can live with dignity and safety, Traore declared in a nationwide address on the one-year anniversary of the confrontation with VANCE. The economic independence we seek is not an end in itself, but a means to achieve the development our people deserve. The confrontation's impact extended beyond bilateral US-Burkina Faso relations, influencing multilateral institutions and global governance. At the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank, African representatives began openly questioning the conditions attached to financial access. At the World Trade Organization, WTO, coalitions of developing nations strengthened their positions in negotiations on intellectual property and market access. The United Nations was not immune to this wave of change. Speeches at the General Assembly grew more assertive, with African, Asian, and Latin American leaders frequently citing Traore's example when advocating for reforms in global governance to ensure greater representation for the Global South. The campaign to reform the Security Council, stalled for decades, gained new momentum, with growing support for the idea of permanent seats for African representatives. For many African youth, the Washington confrontation became a symbol of possibility, proof that established narratives and power structures, long seen as unchangeable, could be challenged. At universities across the continent, debates about economic sovereignty, neocolonialism, and equitable international relations gained new urgency and relevance. Student movements adopted Traore's quotes as slogans in campaigns for educational reform and greater intellectual autonomy. What we're witnessing is not just a shift in diplomatic or economic relations, but a profound transformation in collective consciousness, Senegalese writer Boubacar Diop commented. For generations we were taught to accept certain realities as unchangeable, to see foreign aid as inevitable and economic dependency as our fate. What Traore did was show that another narrative is possible, that we can demand dignity and equality without apology. 2 years after the confrontation, a documentary titled The Washington Moment premiered at the Ouagadougou Film Festival, detailing the events of that day and their far-reaching impact. The film quickly became a global phenomenon, screened at international film festivals and receiving widespread acclaim. The film, produced by an all-African team, included interviews with witnesses to the confrontation, analysis from international experts, and reflections from Traore himself on the significance of the moment. It wasn't planned, Traore revealed in an interview for the documentary. When Vance began speaking to me in such a condescending manner, something awakened inside me. It wasn't just Ibrahim Traoré being attacked. It was the dignity of an entire continent, the history of generations that fought for true independence. My words were simply the expression of a truth already in the hearts of millions of Africans. The documentary became a cultural phenomenon, screened in theaters, universities, and community centers across the African continent. On social media, young people shared clips from the film with hashtags like #DignityOfAfrica and #NewAfricaRising, connecting this historic event to their own aspirations for a more autonomous and prosperous future. The legacy of the confrontation between Traore and Vance continued to grow, inspiring new generations to question established power structures and seek international relationships based on greater fairness and mutual respect. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes it takes courage to speak uncomfortable truths, especially when it means challenging those who have long set the rules of the global game. The story of the confrontation between Burkina Faso's President Traore and U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance in Washington, D.C. is not just a sensational diplomatic event. It also serves as a mirror, reflecting profound lessons that we, as American citizens, can apply to our daily lives. This confrontation highlights the importance of questioning the status quo, even when facing seemingly unshakable powers. When Traore boldly exposed the injustices in mining contracts and questioned the effectiveness of the U.S. military presence in the Sahel, he was not only speaking truth for his country but also challenging outdated definitions of cooperation and aid. In American life, we often accept outdated ways of doing things at work, in our communities, or even in personal relationships simply because that's how it's always been. The lesson here is that, like Traore, we need the courage to look at issues objectively, question existing assumptions, and demand transparency and fairness. In the context of American society, this could involve questioning the distribution of resources, power dynamics in corporations, or policies that appear fair but conceal inequalities. We can learn from Traore's spirit of fearlessly speaking out for core values like respect, fairness, and autonomy. Whether in school discussions, workplaces, or debates about social policies, courageously highlighting what's wrong and demanding real change is essential to building a more just and better society for everyone. This confrontation reminds us that major change often begins with moments when someone dares to speak the truth and challenge the status quo. If you find this story inspiring and want to continue following the journey of nations fighting for autonomy, subscribe to the channel today and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next in-depth analysis of global power dynamics.